The summer heat pressed down on the parking lot like a weight you could not escape. Hundreds of people stood in line outside the arena, fanning themselves with ticket stubs, checking their watches, waiting for the doors to open. And somewhere in the middle of that crowd, a boy who could not have been older than 10 years old opened his mouth and began to sing. His voice was thin, nervous, the kind of voice that wobbles when it reaches for notes it is not quite strong enough to hold. He sang "Love Me Tender," and he sang it the way a child sings when nobody is supposed to be listening. Eyes half closed, hands balled into fists at his sides, lost somewhere inside the melody. The first laugh came from a woman standing 3 feet away, a sharp, surprised sound that cut through the humid air. Then another. Then a man's voice, loud and mocking, saying something about the kid needing to save his performance for the shower. The boy heard them, his cheeks flushed red, his voice faltered for half a second, maybe less, but he did not stop. He kept singing, kept pushing those fragile notes out into the thick summer air while strangers laughed at him like he was the afternoon's entertainment. Nobody in that crowd knew they were witnessing something that would stay buried for decades. Nobody understood that inside that arena, behind walls of security and handlers and carefully managed isolation, a man was about to hear about this boy. And that man would make a decision in the next few hours that broke every rule his team had established. Because Elvis Presley did not just see a child being mocked when he heard this story. He saw a ghost. He saw a memory he had spent 30 years trying to outrun. What happened next would become one of the most protected secrets of his final years. Almost no one was allowed to speak of it publicly. The footage, if any existed, never surfaced. But the people who stood in that arena and witnessed what Elvis did that night carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. So did the boy. This is not just a story about a child who got laughed at and then got lucky. This is a story about what fame takes from you, what it can never give back, and the moments when a man worth millions remembered exactly what it felt like to be worth nothing at all. To understand why Elvis did what he did that night, we have to go back, not to the Vegas stages or the movie sets or the screaming crowds. We have to go back to a place called Tupelo, Mississippi, where a boy with no money and no connections and no reason to believe in himself decided to sing anyway. The house where Elvis Presley grew up had 2 rooms for 3 people, and sometimes not enough food to fill the plates they did have. His father Vernon moved the family from one rental to another, always one step ahead of eviction, never quite able to get solid ground under his feet. Young Elvis wore clothes that marked him as poor before he ever opened his mouth. The other kids in Tupelo knew it. They made sure he knew it too. There is a story that people who grew up with Elvis told for years, though it never made it into the official biographies. When Elvis was 11 years old, he entered a talent contest at the Mississippi-Alabama Fair and Dairy Show. He did not have a guitar. He did not have a fancy outfit. He had a voice, and he had a song, and he had the kind of desperate hope that only children who have nothing else can carry. He did not win. He came in 5th. And when he walked off that stage, a group of older boys followed him behind the fairground tents and told him exactly what they thought of his performance. The words they used do not matter. What matters is that Elvis never talked about that day. Not to reporters, not to biographers, not even to the men who spent 20 years by his side. Some wounds do not heal just because you become famous. Some wounds stay open forever, hidden under rhinestone jumpsuits and standing ovations, bleeding quietly where nobody can see. 20 years later, Elvis Presley could fill any arena in America. He could walk into any room and stop it cold. He had money, fame, power, everything the world tells you that you should want. But the people closest to him knew something the fans never saw. They knew that Elvis collected every bad review, every cruel word written about him, and kept them in a private file. They knew he could recite the insults from memory years after they were published. They knew that the boy who got laughed at behind the fairground tents never really went away. He just learned how to hide. By the summer of 1975, Elvis was 40 years old and falling apart in ways the public could not fully see. His marriage to Priscilla had ended 2 years earlier. His health was failing, though his team worked hard to keep the details out of the press. He performed on a schedule that would have broken a man half his age, moving from city to city in a blur of hotel rooms and backstage corridors that all looked the same after a while. The joy that once defined his performances had become harder to find. Watch the footage from those years, and you can see it in his eyes sometimes, a flicker of something that looks almost like confusion, like a man searching for a feeling he used to know by heart but can no longer locate. He still gave everything he had to his audiences. That never changed. But offstage, in the quiet hours between shows, Elvis Presley was lonely in ways that fame made almost impossible to fix. He could not walk down a street. He could not eat at a restaurant. He could not have a conversation with a stranger without wondering what they wanted from him. The same fame that lifted him out of Tupelo had built walls around him that no amount of money could tear down. And then someone came backstage and told him about a boy in the parking lot. The details of who delivered the message have shifted over the years, depending on who tells the story. Some say it was a member of his security team. Others say it was one of the backup singers who had stepped outside for air. But the core of the story remains the same across every version. There is a kid out there, 9, maybe 10 years old, standing in line with his family, people who clearly drove hours to be here and could not afford tickets to get inside. The kid started singing one of your songs, Love Me Tender, and the people around him started laughing, making fun of him, mocking him right to his face. Elvis listened. His expression did not change at first. The people in the room waited for him to nod and move on, to file this away as another sad story from the crowd, the kind of thing that happens when you are famous and the world brings its broken pieces to your door. But Elvis did not move on. He asked a question that surprised everyone in that room. Is he still singing? The answer came back after a moment of silence. Yes, he will not stop. Something shifted in Elvis Presley then, something that the people who witnessed it would later struggle to describe. It was not quite anger, it was not quite sadness. It was something older than both, something that lived in a place he did not let people see. He gave an order, not a request, an order, and what he demanded broke every security protocol his team had put in place, violated every rule designed to keep him safe and separate from the chaos of the crowds. Nobody argued with him, nobody dared, because the look on his face made clear that this was not negotiable. In a matter of minutes, everything was about to change for a boy standing in a parking lot, singing through his tears, refusing to let the laughter make him stop. And everything was about to change for the king himself, though not in the way anyone expected. The boy did not see the man walking toward him at first. His eyes were fixed on the concrete, watching his own worn sneakers while he tried to keep his voice steady through the third verse of Love Me Tender. The laughter had not stopped. If anything, it had grown louder as more people in line turned to watch the spectacle of a poor kid making a fool of himself in a parking lot. His mother stood 15 feet away, frozen in that particular kind of helplessness that comes when you cannot protect your child from cruelty, but also cannot afford to cause a scene. She had one hand pressed against her mouth. The other gripped her purse strapped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She wanted to pull him away, to spare him the humiliation, but something in the set of his small shoulders told her he would not come. Not yet, not until he finished. A man in a dark jacket moved through the crowd without speaking. People parted for him automatically, the way they do when someone carries authority they cannot quite identify. He stopped about 10 feet from the boy and waited, watching, listening to that thin voice push through the mockery like a small flame refusing to go out in a windstorm. The boy finished the song. For a moment, silence, then more laughter, scattered applause that was not meant as praise, and a voice from somewhere in the crowd shouting that someone should put the kid out of his misery. The man in the dark jacket stepped forward. "Excuse me, son." The boy looked up. His face was streaked with sweat and something that might have been tears, though he would have denied it. His eyes held that particular mixture of defiance and terror that belongs to children who have learned too early that the world does not reward vulnerability. The man knelt down so they were eye to eye. His voice dropped low enough that the people nearby had to strain to hear. "Did you drive a long way to be here today?" The boy nodded, 4 hours. His family had left before dawn. They had pooled money for gas, but could not stretch it far enough to include tickets. Standing outside the arena, breathing the same air as the people who would see the show, had seemed like enough. Until it was not. Until the music inside him had demanded to come out, consequences be damned. The man in the dark jacket studied the boy's face for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made the boy's mother gasp loud enough for everyone within 20 feet to hear. A backstage pass, laminated, official, the kind of thing that money alone could not buy. Someone wants to meet you, if your mama says it is okay. The walk through the service entrance felt like crossing into another universe. The boy kept his hand in his mother's grip, his eyes moving constantly, trying to absorb details he knew he would want to remember forever. Concrete corridors gave way to carpeted hallways. Security guards nodded as they passed. Voices echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, laughter and conversation, and the distant thump of equipment being tested. His mother had stopped crying somewhere around the third security checkpoint, but her hand still trembled against his. She kept whispering questions to the man leading them, questions he answered with polite vagueness that only increased her confusion. Who arranged this? Why her son? What exactly was happening? The man stopped outside a door that looked no different from any other door in the hallway. He knocked twice, waited for a response from inside, then stepped back. Go on in, both of you. The room was smaller than the boy had expected. Simpler. A couch, a few chairs, a table with water bottles and untouched food. And standing near the far wall, watching them enter, was the man whose voice the boy had been imitating in parking lots and bedrooms and school talent shows for as long as he could remember. Elvis Presley looked tired. That was the first thing the boy noticed, though he would not fully process it until years later. The face was familiar from 100 photographs and television appearances, but something about seeing it in person revealed what the cameras always managed to hide. Lines around the eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. A heaviness in the way he held himself, as though the simple act of standing required more effort than it should. But when Elvis smiled, everything else disappeared. The exhaustion, the weight, the strange sadness that seemed to hang in the air around him. The smile transformed his face into something the boy recognized instantly, something that matched the voice on the records and the man who moved like lightning in those old movie clips. I heard you singing out there. The boy could not speak. His voice, which had pushed through mockery and laughter and his own fear just minutes ago, abandoned him completely. He stood there with his mouth slightly open, frozen in a moment he had never imagined could actually exist. Elvis crossed the room slowly, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. When he reached him, he did something that made the boy's mother press her hand against her mouth for the second time that afternoon. He knelt down, just as the man in the dark jacket had done outside, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. They told me people were laughing at you, making fun. The boy managed a nod. His throat felt like it was filled with concrete. Elvis held his gaze with an intensity that seemed impossible for such a simple moment. His voice dropped lower, soft enough that the boy's mother could not hear what he said next. That used to happen to me too, every single day. People told me I could not sing, told me I was wasting my time, told me I should give up and find real work like everybody else. The boy's eyes widened. He could not imagine anyone telling Elvis Presley he could not sing. It seemed as absurd as telling the sun it could not shine. You know what I did when they laughed at me? The boy shook his head. I kept singing, just like you did out there. I kept singing until they could not laugh anymore because they were too busy listening. Elvis straightened up and extended his hand toward the boy. A formal gesture, man to man, as though they were equals meeting for the first time. What is your name, son? The boy told him. His voice came back, thin and shaking, but present. Elvis repeated the name like he was committing it to memory. Then he glanced at the door, at the clock on the wall, at something only he could see in the distance of his own thoughts. When he looked back at the boy, his expression had changed. The showman's warmth was still there, but beneath it something else had surfaced. Something harder, something that looked almost like determination. How would you feel about singing that song one more time tonight, not in a parking lot, on my stage, in front of everybody? The boy's mother made a sound that was not quite a word. Her hand found her son's shoulder and gripped it hard enough to leave marks. Elvis did not wait for her protest. He addressed her directly, his voice carrying the particular gentleness he reserved for mothers who looked at him like he might steal their children away. "Ma'am, your son has something special. I could hear it from inside this building. And those people out there who laughed at him, they are going to be sitting in my audience tonight. I think they ought to see what happens when somebody refuses to let the laughter stop them." The mother tried to speak, tried to explain that her son was not ready, that the pressure would be too much, that she could not possibly allow him to walk onto a stage in front of thousands of strangers and risk even greater humiliation than he had already endured. But the boy spoke first. One word. "Yes." And in that single syllable, everything changed. The trajectory of a summer evening tilted on its axis. A child who had been mocked in a parking lot was about to stand in front of more people than his small town contained, singing the song that had marked him as a target less than an hour before. Elvis nodded once, slowly, as though confirming something he had already known. Then he turned to the man who had led them backstage and issued instructions in a low voice that the boy could not quite hear. Names, times, logistics, the machinery of a concert being adjusted to accommodate an unscheduled guest. When he turned back to the boy, the tiredness had returned to his eyes, but beneath it, something else glowed, something that looked almost like relief, as though helping this child had released a pressure valve somewhere deep inside him. "You are going to do great, son, and those people who laughed at you, they are going to spend the rest of their lives telling everybody they know that they were there the night they watched you sing." The boy did not know yet what this moment would cost Elvis. He did not know that the man standing before him was fighting battles invisible to everyone in the room. He did not know that this act of kindness was more than generosity. It was recognition, it was rescue, and it was about to become the most important thing that happened on that stage all night. The stage lights hit the boy like a physical force he had not anticipated. Heat and brightness, and the weight of 12,000 faces turning toward him all at once, a wave of attention so overwhelming that his feet stopped moving 3 steps past the curtain. His hand, still wrapped in Elvis's larger grip, went rigid with sudden terror. The crowd did not know what they were seeing at first. A child on stage at an Elvis Presley concert was unusual but not unheard of. Elvis had brought fans up before, had kissed women and shaken hands with veterans, and occasionally let someone hold a microphone for a few seconds of fumbling amateur performance. The audience settled into expectant amusement, waiting to see what kind of brief entertainment this interruption would provide before the real show continued. Elvis guided the boy to center stage and positioned him in front of the microphone stand. The height was wrong. The microphone hung at chest level for Elvis, which meant it floated somewhere above the boy's head like a chrome moon he could not quite reach. A stagehand rushed out and made adjustments while the crowd murmured and shifted in their seats. The boy looked out at the audience and felt his stomach drop through the floor. Somewhere in that mass of faces sat the people who had laughed at him in the parking lot. He could not identify them in the blinding wash of stage lights, but he knew they were there, watching, waiting to see if he would fail again, this time in front of witnesses who numbered in the thousands instead of dozens. Elvis leaned down and spoke directly into his ear. The words were too soft for the microphone to catch, too private for anyone else to hear. Whatever he said made the boy's shoulders straighten slightly. His chin lifted a fraction of an inch. Then Elvis stepped back, leaving the boy alone at center stage, with nothing between him and 12,000 strangers, but a microphone and the memory of every person who had ever told him he was not good enough. The opening notes of "Love Me Tender" floated up from the band. Elvis had given them the signal without the boy noticing, had orchestrated this moment down to the musical cue so that the child would not have to stand in silence trying to remember how the song began. The boy opened his mouth. No sound came out. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the front rows. Someone in the balcony shouted something that might have been encouragement or might have been mockery. The boy's hands began to shake visibly, tremors running up his arms and into his shoulders until his whole body seemed to vibrate with fear. Elvis did not move from his position 6 feet behind the boy. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, watching, waiting. His face revealed nothing that the audience could read, but the band members who had worked with him for years saw something in his eyes they had rarely witnessed before. A tension that went beyond performance anxiety or concern for a struggling guest, something that looked almost like pain. The music cycled back to the beginning of the verse. The band gave the boy another chance, another entry point, another opportunity to find his voice. This time he sang. The first note cracked badly. It came out thin and wobbly and roughly a quarter tone flat, the sound of a child's voice straining against terror and failing to fully overcome it. More laughter from the audience, louder this time, less restrained. The boy heard it, and his voice faltered again, dipping towards silence. But he did not stop. He pushed into the second line of the verse with his eyes squeezed shut, blocking out the lights and the faces and the crushing awareness of his own inadequacy. His voice steadied slightly, still imperfect, still unmistakably the voice of a frightened child rather than a polished performer, but present, committed, refusing to surrender. Something shifted in the audience. The laughter did not stop entirely, but it began to thin, replaced by a different quality of attention. People who had been smirking started to listen. The boy was not good, not by any professional standard, but there was something in his determination that demanded acknowledgement. He was fighting for every note, and the fight itself was becoming the performance. Elvis remained motionless behind him. His eyes never left the boy's back. His hands stayed clasped, his body still, but the people who knew him best could see the cost of that stillness. His jaw was tight. His shoulders had drawn up slightly, the way they did when he was working to control emotions he did not want to display. The boy reached the chorus. His voice cracked again on the word tender, splitting the note into something that was half song and half sob. A woman in the third row pressed her hand against her chest. A man near the aisle blinked rapidly and looked away. And then Elvis moved. He crossed the 6 feet between them in 3 strides and knelt beside the boy, one arm wrapping around his shoulders in a gesture so natural it seemed rehearsed, even though everyone watching knew it was not. He tilted his head toward the microphone and began to sing along, his voice joining the boys, lifting it, supporting it, transforming the solo performance into a duet that no one in that arena had expected. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. 12,000 people rose to their feet in a wave that started at the front and rolled backward through the venue like a tide. The applause began before the song ended, building into a roar that drowned out both voices and forced them to finish the final verse in a kind of joyful pantomime, mouths moving against a wall of sound that made the words themselves irrelevant. The boy turned to look at Elvis when the song ended. His face was wet with tears he had not noticed shedding. His chest heaved with the effort of breathing against emotions too large for his small body to contain. He looked like someone who had just survived something, which in a way he had. Elvis smiled at him. The cameras that existed in that era, the few personal recordings that fans managed to smuggle past security, captured that smile and preserved it. It was not the showman's grin or the movie star's smolder or any of the practiced expressions that had made Elvis Presley the most photographed face in America. It was something simpler and more raw. The smile of a man who had just watched a child accomplish something he understood at the deepest possible level. The boy's mother was crying in the wings. Stagehands who had seen everything in their years of working concerts stood with suspiciously bright eyes and suddenly necessary coughs. Even members of the Memphis Mafia, men who prided themselves on professional detachment and had witnessed Elvis's generosity hundreds of times before, found themselves looking away and clearing their throats. But what the audience did not see, what the cameras did not capture, and the witnesses did not fully understand until years later, was the expression that crossed Elvis's face when he finally stood up and guided the boy toward the wings. It was not triumph. It was not satisfaction at having created a memorable moment or generated the kind of genuine emotion that would be talked about for decades. It was grief. The specific, terrible grief of a man who has just given someone else the rescue he knows he will never receive himself. Elvis had saved this boy from the laughter. He had transformed humiliation into triumph, had given a child a memory that would sustain him for the rest of his life. But no one had done that for Elvis. No one had appeared in the fairgrounds of Tupelo to lift him up when the older boys mocked him behind the tents. No one had taken his hand and led him to a place where the cruelty could not reach him. He had saved himself, alone, through talent and determination, and a refusal to stop singing even when every voice around him said he should. And the cost of that lonely salvation had never fully healed. The boy left the stage to thunderous applause. His mother gathered him into her arms with a ferocity that suggested she might never let go again. Backstage, people congratulated them, pressed phone numbers and business cards into the mother's trembling hands, promised follow-up conversations that some would keep and others would forget. Elvis returned to his performance. He sang for another 90 minutes, giving the audience everything they had paid for and more. He was professional, polished, exactly what they expected from the king of rock and roll. But those who watched him closely that night said something was different, a quality in his voice that had not been there before, a faraway look that flickered across his face between songs, as though part of him had left the building with that boy and was not sure how to find its way back. After the show, Elvis sat alone in his dressing room for a long time. His team knew better than to disturb him when he got like this. The silence stretched into an hour, then longer. When someone finally knocked to remind him that the cars were waiting, he emerged looking somehow older than he had before the concert began. He never spoke publicly about that night. Neither did the people who worked for him. The story passed into the private mythology of those who witnessed it, shared in whispers and late-night conversations among people who understood that some moments were too precious and too painful to expose to the glare of publicity. The boy grew up carrying that night inside him like a talisman against every future moment of doubt and mockery. Elvis died 2 years later, alone in a bathroom in Memphis, surrounded by people who loved him but could not save him from the things that were killing him slowly. And somewhere in the space between those two outcomes lives the truth that neither triumph nor tragedy ever tells the whole story. The boy went home carrying something he did not yet have the language to describe. His mother drove through the night while he sat silent in the passenger seat, replaying the memory of those stage lights and that roaring crowd until the images began to blur into something that felt more like a dream than a real experience. By the time they pulled into their driveway as the sun came up, he had already begun the long process of trying to understand what had happened to him and why. The other kids at school did not believe him at first. A boy from a family that could not afford concert tickets, claiming he had sung on stage with Elvis Presley, sounded like exactly the kind of lie a desperate child would tell to make himself seem important. The mockery he faced in the weeks after that night cut differently than the laughter in the parking lot. This was sustained, deliberate cruelty from people who saw his story as evidence of delusion rather than proof of something miraculous. His mother kept the backstage pass in a drawer beside her bed. She showed it to the doubters when they came, let them hold the laminated proof in their hands and examine it for signs of forgery. Some believed. Others insisted that backstage passes could be faked, that the whole thing was an elaborate fantasy constructed by a boy who could not accept his own ordinariness. The local newspaper ran a small story about a month later, after a reporter heard the rumor and tracked down the family for an interview. The boy's mother provided what few details she could remember through the haze of shock and emotion that had clouded that entire evening. The story ran on page 7, below an advertisement for farm equipment, and generated a brief flurry of attention before fading into the archives where small-town miracles go to be forgotten. Elvis never reached out to the family. No letter arrived. No phone call came. The boy waited for months, checking the mailbox every afternoon with a hope that gradually hardened into something he refused to name. He told himself that Elvis was busy, that famous people could not possibly follow up with every person they helped, that the memory of what happened was gift enough. He was right about the last part, though it took him decades to fully understand why. 2 years after that night, Elvis Presley died in Memphis. The boy was 12 years old. He heard the news on the radio while eating breakfast before school, and the spoon dropped from his hand and clattered against the table in a silence that seemed to swallow the entire room. His mother reached for him, but he was already gone, already retreating to his bedroom where he could process this impossible information away from watching eyes. The man who had knelt down and looked him in the eye was gone. The voice that had joined his own, lifting him through the terror of that stage, would never sing another note. The boy sat on his bed and cried in a way he had not cried since the parking lot, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest, somewhere he had not known existed until that moment. The world mourned Elvis in ways that ranged from genuine grief to performative spectacle. Newspapers published retrospectives. Radio stations played his music on endless loops. Fans gathered outside Graceland in numbers that overwhelmed the Memphis police. The boy watched all of this from a distance, aware that his connection to this global tragedy was both impossibly small and deeply personal. He was one of thousands of people Elvis had helped over the years. The king's generosity was legendary, documented in countless stories of cars given to strangers, medical bills paid for fans who could not afford treatment, quiet acts of kindness that often went unreported until years after the fact. The boy understood that he was not special, that Elvis had probably forgotten him within days of that concert, that the moment which had restructured his entire life was likely just another evening in the blur of touring and performing that consumed Elvis's final years. This knowledge should have diminished the gift. It did the opposite. The boy grew up and became a man who understood something about kindness that most people never learn. He understood that generosity does not require memory to be real. Elvis did not need to remember his name for the rescue to count. The impact of what happened that night existed independently of Elvis's awareness, growing and spreading through the boy's life in ways that touched everyone he encountered. He became the kind of man who noticed when children were being mocked. He developed an instinct for identifying the moments when someone needed a witness, when the presence of one person who refused to laugh could change the entire trajectory of an experience. His friends and family described him as unusually kind without understanding the source of that kindness. When interviewers tracked him down in later years, asking him to share his story for documentaries and retrospectives about Elvis's life, he always hesitated before agreeing. The memory felt sacred in a way that public exposure threatened to diminish. He worried that telling the story too many times would wear it smooth, would transform it from a living experience into a polished anecdote designed for consumption. But he always agreed in the end, because he understood that the story did not belong to him alone. It belonged to every child who had ever been laughed at for daring to dream. It belonged to every person who had ever wondered whether famous people remembered what it felt like to be unknown and vulnerable. It belonged to the complicated legacy of a man who could fill stadiums but could not fill the emptiness inside himself. Elvis Presley has been dead for nearly 5 decades. His music still plays on radio stations around the world. His image still sells merchandise to generations of fans who never saw him perform live. His cultural impact has been analyzed and celebrated and criticized and reanalyzed until it sometimes seems like there is nothing left to say about who he was and what he meant. But the stories that matter most are rarely the ones that make it into the official histories. They live in the memories of people who experienced private moments of connection with a public figure, moments that revealed something true about the human being beneath the legend. The man who was once a boy in a parking lot still thinks about that night. His hair is gray now. His voice has deepened and roughened with age. He no longer sings in public, not because he is afraid of mockery, but because that song belongs to a moment he does not want to dilute through repetition. Sometimes, late at night, he will hum a few bars of Love Me Tender to himself. The melody carries him back across the decades to a summer evening when the world laughed at him and the king decided that the laughter should stop. He remembers the heat of the stage lights, the sound of 12,000 people rising to their feet, the brief, fierce pressure of Elvis's arm around his shoulders. And he remembers something else, something he did not fully register at the time, but has come to understand as the most important part of the story. The look on Elvis's face when he knelt down to sing with a frightened child was not pity, it was not showmanship, it was not even kindness in the simple sense of the word. It was recognition. Elvis saw himself in that parking lot. He heard his own voice in those wavering notes. He felt the echo of every humiliation he had survived on his way to becoming the most famous entertainer in the world, and he refused to let history repeat itself without intervention. The rescue was real, the triumph was real, but so was the pain that made such rescues necessary, the wound that Elvis carried from Tupelo to Memphis and never found a way to heal. Perhaps that is the most honest thing anyone can say about Elvis Presley. He spent his life giving others the salvation he could not give himself. He lifted strangers out of their worst moments while sinking slowly into his own. He remembered what it felt like to be small and mocked and dismissed, and he used that memory to change lives even as his own life spiraled beyond his control. The boy he saved grew up to be happy, the man who saved him did not. And somewhere in the space between those two outcomes lives everything worth knowing about fame and kindness, and the weight of carrying a crown you never asked to wear. The people who tell you they understand Elvis Presley are usually lying, to you or to themselves or to both at once. He was too complicated for easy summaries, too contradictory for simple narratives, too human for the mythology that has grown up around his name. But sometimes a single story can illuminate more than 1,000 biographies. Sometimes the smallest moment reveals the largest truth. A boy sang in a parking lot. People laughed at him. And the king, tired and hurting and fighting battles no one around him fully understood, decided that the laughter had to stop. That is the story. That is the legacy. That is what remains when everything else fades away. Most people only knew Elvis through the music and the movies and the headlines that followed him everywhere he went. They knew the jumpsuits and the karate moves and the way he could make a stadium full of strangers feel like they were the only person in the room. But the people who experienced his kindness directly, the ones who felt his hand reach down to lift them up, they knew something different. They knew that the king never forgot what it meant to be no one at all. So we have to ask you, do you believe Elvis ever escaped the boy he used to be? Or did he spend his whole life trying to save the child that no one saved in Tupelo? Tell us what you think in the comments below.